Welcome, everybody, to the first day of LITLIT, the Little Literary Fair. We are an annual celebration of independent publishing here on the West Coast. Thank you for being here today. As Alexander mentioned, my name is Kelly. I'm the Public Programs Manager at the Los Angeles Review of Books, and I'm charged with making sure that our programs help increase access to the world of literary and cultural production, which is the bedrock of LITLIT here today. So thank you for supporting us. Our booth is just right out there beyond this garden. I also want to take the opportunity to thank our incredible co-host, Hauser and Wirth, and Hauser and Wirth Publishers, and that includes the whole team. You've seen them around. Russell's right here in the pink. Alexander, of course, hanging out in the wing. Jocelyn is out there somewhere. Elizabeth P., who's not here. Elizabeth L., all of the gallery assistants, Ben, and then we have Armin here running our AV. It's really taken the entire village, and our LARB team, especially two. They're right there. I see them, Chloe, Danielle, Maya. I could go on and on and on, but thank you. My heart is very warm today. And I appreciate you all being here. I also want to take time to thank the organizations that our incredible panelists founded here today. Firstly, we have, I guess I'll go in alphabetical order, that seems most fair, the Community Literature Initiative. Woo! Woo!
If you do so.
Oh, I did. Beyond Baroque, just pretend that beat came first. Kaya Press. And Words Uncaged. And now I'll turn it over to our tremendous moderator, Lynne Thompson. Lynne Thompson, I'm blocking her. Lynne is Poet Laureate for the City of Los Angeles and host of the podcast Poems on Air that spotlights poets and their poems weekly on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and the LA Public Library's website. She is the author of 3 collections of poetry, Start with a Small Guitar and Beg No Pardon, winner of the Perugia Book Award and the Great Lakes Colleges Association's New Writers Award, and Fretwork, winner of the Marsh Hawk Poetry Prize. Thompson's recent work has been in or is forthcoming in Catamaran, North American Review, The Common, and Best American Poetry, among others. She's a powerhouse.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, Lynne, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who came out. Kelly said her heart was warm. That's because it is really warm out here. So I appreciate you all coming out on this steamy Saturday. It's nice to be back live again after little pesky disease that was going around. So I'm going to kick it off with my panelists, and I'm going to call on each of them to introduce their organizations and then go back to them for some follow-up questions before we open it up to all of you for your questions. So let's start with you, Hiram. Tell us a little bit about CLI and World Stage Press.
All right, so the Community Literature Initiative is a 501c literary nonprofit focused on helping writers to finish and publish books. And primarily we focus on books of poetry. And so the program is entering its 10th year. And so just want to shout out to some CLI alumni in the house, Cynthia Briano from season 1, Julaine Lee, some other, probably some other people in there. It's a 2-semester program, so it's 8 months of editing and just rewriting, gathering poems that are like in your basement, in your shoebox, in the journal, in the trunk of your car, like putting them in a manuscript. And then the last 2 months of our program is book production. And so we do editing, cover design, layout design, proofing. And so on the last day of class, students walk out of our program with their book in their hand. And so then we have an event at USC called the Author Draft. And that's when about like 15, 16 small presses come and hear the CLI students pitch their books. Yeah, but we also have like self-publishing services there too. And like last time we had one literary agent, because one thing that we champion in CLI is like, just like all the lanes. Like whether it's self-publishing or small press or the large press, like champion all the lanes, but really want people to be focused on like connecting with people, with audiences, and getting their books in people's hands however they can. So probably a year after the program started, we created, Connie Williams and I created World Stage Press out of the World Stage Performance Gallery, which has a focus on the creation and proliferation of African American literature and beyond. And so we make the books right there inside of the World Stage. And we release about one book a month, and we have 12 book releases a year there at the World Stage. The third Wednesday of the month at the Anansi Writers Workshop. So,
Address?
4321 Degnan Boulevard. Countdown to it get down. So, yep, that's me.
Thank you so much. And speaking of Beyond, let's go to Quentin. Let's talk a little bit about Beyond Baroque.
Yeah, thanks, Lynne, and thanks, Hiram, as well. I'm the director of Beyond Baroque Literary Arts Center. We are located in Venice, and we are actually Los Angeles' oldest continually existing literary institution. Founded in 1968. I think, if I can count correctly, that makes us 54 years old this year. And we exist to support writers and cultivate new writing. The bulk of our focus is on poets and poetry, and so we have a variety of workshops. Our Wednesday night workshop has actually been running continuously since 1969, every Wednesday. A huge swath of Los Angeles' better-known poets, as well as other writers and artists, have gone through that workshop, sort of cut their teeth in that. Everyone from Wanda Coleman, Amy Gersler, to any number of other folks along down the line. We have paid workshops as well. We have youth programming. Amanda Gorman came out of that program also. We also have a really large suite of readings and performances in our theater. We have a small black box theater in Venice. We have about 100 events a year in that theater, mostly readings, but panels, talks, multimedia performances, films sometimes. We have an art gallery, the Mike Kelly Gallery. We have a bookstore. We have an archive that collects the sort of history of small press publications in Los Angeles from the 60s onward. And we just exist to serve writers and really to provide sort of a nurturing space for them to learn their craft and to put on new work. And so I really encourage everyone to come check us out in Venice. It's a great space. It's a beautiful space. I'll just say one more thing too. Since we have a very historical perspective on Los Angeles literature, given our history, it's just seeing this fair here, being on this panel with everyone. It's, I think, a real testament just to the flowering of Los Angeles literature, over the past several decades. It's really just grown into this beautiful, beautiful community. And so, I'm just very glad to be here.
We're glad to have you here. Thanks so much. Neela.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Banerjee. I'm the managing editor of a small press called Kaya Press. We're an independent 501c3 press dedicated to Asian, Pacific American, and Asian diasporic literature. So we are actually founded back in 1994 in New York City. And the press came about at a time where the co-founders of the press at that time really wanted to have an alternative to kind of the multiculturalism curtain that was happening at that time, that everything needed to be, kind of in the same vein. We wanted a space for innovative work, for experimental work, for work that kind of went against what was really being pushed and published at that time. And so it was really exciting to create the press, come out new in New York City at that time. So one of our first big, we publish all kinds of literature, but poetry has always been a huge part of what we publish. And really excitingly, one of the first major poetry books that Kaya published was Seshu Foster's City Terrace Field Manual, which is still one of our bestsellers. And, at that time, Seshu, at this point, an iconic Los Angeles writer, was, up and coming. And then, at that point, really introducing the world, the literary world, to this little neighborhood in East LA, and the vision of what it's like to grow up here as a half Japanese American in a Latinx neighborhood, telling these stories, writing in prose poetry form. So I think we've, since that time, since the mid 90s, continued to hold those ideas. The publisher Sun Young Lee has been around since around 1995, and her fortitude is a real testament to keeping something like a tiny Asian American press alive and keeping it strong in all kinds of different climates. Our offices originally were below Canal Street in New York City, so on 9/11, she has a lot of stories about not being able to go to the office for many months. And soon after that, she came to California to get her MFA at Irvine in poetry and kind of kept the press in her backpack, putting out books. And then really excitingly, in 2011, we landed here and are now housed in the American Studies and Ethnicity Department at USC, which has really allowed us to stay independent but really flourish and stabilize. And that's when I came on after moving here from San Francisco. And I think I agree, in this past 10 years, over 10 years, for us as an Asian American press to land in Los Angeles, it really feels like from New York, it felt like the future of literature. This is where it's happening. It's not top down, it's horizontal. I've collaborated with so many of the people on the stage and so many of you out there in different ways. And really, more than anything, lately when I talk about what I do, I identify myself as a collaborator, and I'm excited to talk about our work and how that, I think, is a key part of the resilience and power of poetry.
Thank you, Neela. So necessary. We're so glad you're here. And finally, Bidhan.
Thank you. Words Uncaged is an organization that was founded in a prison setting, and really the idea behind it is that when I first went into work in prisons as a volunteer, the people I met in there did not match the narratives that were being put out about who they were in the kind of stereotypical popular culture representations of who was incarcerated. And there's actually many people that helped found that program in Lancaster, Los Angeles State Prison, who are here today, some of whom had life without parole sentences at the time that I met them. I'm not going to say who they are, because I think part of the point I'm trying to make here is that when you meet a lot of the people that are demonized by narratives, and then you meet who those people are, you would think, how is this person sentenced to die in prison? And the idea behind Words Uncaged is to create a platform for those voices to come into the public. One of the things about prison systems in the US is all kinds of communications are cut off from the people who are inside. It's very difficult to make a phone call, for example. It's very expensive and limited access. There's no internet. There's no real way for these voices to come out. So the basic philosophy behind Words Uncaged is to allow a kind of transparent transmission through the only way that we had available to us at that time, which is just pen and paper. And our job was to kind of create these different platforms through which these voices could kind of meet you as the general public. So there's different ways we do that. We started with books, and books is still the main thing that we do. We have a quarterly publication that we distribute for free throughout prisons in California, and there's copies available for free for you today as well. We're starting a podcast at Calipatria State Prison, and we have a program on death row in Texas as well, and our book from that is here as well. And death row in particular in Texas is the most dramatic disjuncture between who the people are that you meet when you go there and their sentences and their fates and how they're kind of represented. So, and it's obviously the most restrictive place to work in and the hardest place to work in. And, you know, there are people there that you only get access out of your cell, a 10 by 6 cell, for 2 hours a day. So the ability to keep your humanity and to be able to express that is really extraordinary. So I hope you go and look at these stories and see who these people are for yourself.
Thank you, Bidhan. So as you can see, we have an amazing panel here. I think many of you signed up for this panel, and so that you know that its title is Poetry Rising, Resistance, Resilience, and Healing. And from all of these people, they have very unique perspectives. So I'm going to go back and start with you, Quentin, with Beyond Baroque. You spoke a little bit about the fact that not only does Beyond Baroque support literary artists, but visual artists as well. And can you tell the audience a little bit about how those two come together in terms of resistance, resilience, and healing?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Lynne. So for Beyond Baroque, it all starts with language for us. We are, as our mission says, dedicated to the artistic possibilities of language. And we take a fairly expansive view of that in the sense that, yes, our focus is primarily on poets, to a certain extent on fiction writers, nonfiction, even playwriting as well, but also the visual arts and the performing arts. Language is, I think, it's really can center resistance as well as resilience and healing, because it's this sort of great collective resource that we have. We all share language. It's our community. It's the basis of all of our communications. At the same time, it's something that's very much imposed on us. It's something that is given to us. We're not creating our own language. We're named, we're identified, we're given words, from society, from power structures to us. And so, starting with language and with poetry, in particular, giving people the tools and the encouragement and the space to really think about language, to reclaim their narratives, to reclaim language for themselves and for their own purposes. That's a very powerful tool for resistance to dominant power structures. It's a tool for healing, for giving people the ability to sort of think through their own experiences and reshape them with their own imaginations, and according to their own interests and to really process what's happened to them in their lives. But even so, and I am getting to your question, even so, I had to start with that. But even so, even within literature, thinking of poetry as just one thing, even that can be a little narrowing, we find. And so we really want to take language and think about it in all its dimensions. It has a visual dimension, it has an oral dimension, it has graphic dimensions, and there are other languages out there. There's language of visual arts, there's language of film. And so we really want to encourage writers and artists to think broadly about how these sort of forces shape everything we do, and to sort of rethink them, even from what are sort of constraints like genres. This is what a poem is supposed to be. This is what a painting is supposed to be. This is what a play is supposed to be. And giving them a kind of expansive sense allows to really open up the minds to sort of be as freely functioning as possible, to have the imagination sort of play across multiple fields, and create a community that's collaborative and is willing to call out oppression, to call out, the sort of depredations that we find in our society. And Beyond Baroque, across 54 years in Venice, it's seen enormous changes. When we were founded, we were very much in a bohemian neighborhood that was quite diverse, that was low rent. It's gentrified enormously. And so one of the things we try to do is to have, writers and artists still have a space where they can comment on the changes in the community and across the broader city, and to find community with each other, and to sort of form alliances that can really speak to the current moment. And so it's very much a matter of trying to be as expansive as possible, and in addressing the society that we live in. So.
And does a great job. It's one of the places when people say, I'm new to the city, where do I go to find poetry? Well, you see good examples up here, and Beyond Baroque is certainly one of those. Neela, let me turn to you. As I was preparing for this panel, I was thinking about the increase in crimes against the Asian American and that diaspora across the country and across the world. I read a report that from 2020 to 2021, the crimes, violent crimes in that community had risen 333%. It seemed kind of an impossible number. I'm wondering how Kaya Press goes about trying to handle these issues of resistance and resilience in light of these horrific crimes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lynne, for that thoughtful question. I think it's for a lot of us who are interested in writing and reading and history, these past few years have been both this moment of really coming home where we're all coming to this point that maybe a lot of us in our different communities have been holding. We all know about statistics, so maybe from 2018 to 2019 and then comparing 2020 to 2021, there's a huge increase. But we're sitting here not far from LA's Chinatown, where in 1871, 19 Chinese immigrants were killed in one of the biggest mass murders of immigrants in this country, and then 15 of those Chinese immigrants were lynched because a policeman was killed in crossfire of a small gang fight. That's the legacy that we all know this country is built on and has continued. When we were thinking about this panel, the Kaya staff and I were all talking about our own relationship to these statistics and these ideas. I mean, Sun Young Lee, the publisher, post-college, she was working with an organization in New York City called the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence and she was organizing taxi drivers that at that time in the early 90s were facing a lot of violence and a lot of crime. So that was the core that she built her literary work on. That's where she's coming from. That's why, the political kind of background that she's building her work on. I graduated from college in the year 2000, so shortly after that, I began organizing around crimes aimed at South Asians after 9/11, right? Again, it's kind of the platform that I built my career on. That's where I'm coming from. So I think coming into these past few years, it doesn't feel like a big shift, but a real reckoning of things that we've known for a long time, and I think that's a core part of the work of wanting to put out voices from this community, from this diaspora, to constantly humanize, to give different experiences. We're really excited, though. It wasn't on purpose, but our book that's coming out this fall is by a poet named Jenny Liu. It's her debut collection of poetry, and she is a Chinese American woman, half Chinese, but was also a professional MMA fighter. And her collection, Muscle Memory, weaves together her experiences of violence living in an Asian woman's body, of diaspora, and of what it's like to be in the ring and to be empowered and embodied in this moment. So we're really excited that lined up to kind of be something, not an answer at all, but something maybe that we can all celebrate at this time. Thank you.
That's good to hear about that book. That all these voices have a place and need to be heard. Bidhan, kind of the other side of that coin is what you were talking about that your organization does in terms of the prison industrial complex and its determination, apparently, to treat the inmates as inhumanly as possible. And I was wondering if you could expand a little bit about the work that you do that specifically tries to overcome that impetus.
Yeah, and you'll be able to kind of meet some of our members who are here to get first-hand narratives, of this experience. But essentially what happens when you go into a prison in the US is you get given a number and that identifies you. So it's literally a way of stripping your identity when you come into a prison. Obviously you have to wear a, uniform, and everything that would kind of indicate your singularity as a human being is taken away from you. So it's a kind of structural dehumanization process that happens, coupled with all those things I mentioned about, being, having direct communication to the public largely taken away from you. And so the other thing that happens in this kind of process of dehumanization is you get, it's like a hungry narrative that eats you up of the crime that you committed at a particular age becomes the sole thing that you're kind of known for. And this becomes not just an act that you did, however wrong that act might be, but a kind of identity. You become known as, you know, a gang member or a murderer or a thief or whatever the thing might be. And all the other kind of complexity of you as a human being is taken away from you. And the problem with this, of course, is you know, there's a lot of problems with it. But one way is if you think about the idea, and in California, we recently added the R to CDC, so it's CDCR, meaning that rehabilitation is supposed to be part of what this institution does. So if you think about rehabilitation and you think about the person being a participant in their rehabilitation and their restoration and repairing the harm that they've caused, how can a person do that if they're trapped in a narrative that identifies them with an act from the past, and all the other kind of complexity of them as a human being is left out of that narrative? And so we have people here in the audience who were incarcerated at the age of 12 years old, 16 years old, 17 years old, and that had they not had an opportunity to kind of reauthor themselves, would still be trapped in those narratives. And so the idea with Words Uncaged and with our programs, kind of from a sort of philosophical perspective, is to say, to sort of externalize that event, to say, okay, that event happened, no one's denying that event caused harm. But how do you repair that harm that's caused? How do you kind of understand someone as a fully complex, rounded human being? And so the idea here is when you externalize that and you create a separation and say, the event happened, but I'm more than that event, then what is that story that you want to tell? And so that's kind of an act of reauthoring, if you like, to kind of counter that dominant narrative. And that allows for all these other ways of being to emerge. And you know, all our members that you see that you'll meet in the audience or at our booth are people that are doing incredible things. There's so much more than that very small narrative that was put on them at a particularly young age. And I think one of the things that's sort of unique about the US institution, as opposed to, I was just in Norway working with the Norwegian prison system. And what's unique here is there's something beyond the punishment for the act. So, you know, if you get sentenced to a certain amount of years, that's the punishment in Norway. But everything else is around the transformation and the repairing of the harm in that period. But here, it's like a stigmata that's put upon you, and this becomes the sole singular narrative that identifies you as a human being. But of course, people in prison are no different to any of us, and all of us have done mistakes in our life. It's just when you are in a particular context, that mistake can be so big that there's no oxygen for these other stories of human subjectivity to emerge. So that's really what we're trying to do. And then the different mediums in which we do it all stem from that basic philosophy.
Thank you. Great work that you're doing. Let me just turn to you. Please, yes. They need to be acknowledged, and it's important work. And we'll finish up before we open it up to all of you for questions. I bet you have a lot of them. Turn to you, Hiram, to talk a little bit about this idea of collaboration. I mean, this panel is a collaboration of sorts, and I think we've all learned that in order to get to the healing that we so badly need as a city, as a country, we need to work together. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how CLI and World Press started and how you're going beyond that to collaborate with others.
Okay. One of the things that I thought about when I thought about these three words in this panel, like resistance, resilience, and healing, I first thought about like what CLI in its creation is resisting. And I think really it's resisting like this traditional path to publishing, you know, which is like write your query letter and mail it, wait 9 months for 80 rejection letters, cry, then do it all over again. You know, like, and I feel like we're resisting that whole path and attempting to personalize this whole field, right? So instead of beyond Baroque, it's Quentin. Instead of Kaya, it's Neela. You know, instead of not occult, it's Daniel Lisi. Instead of Larb, it's Tom Lutz. You know, like, and how can we like foster connection, or rather an environment where these people can sit down and have a conversation? Because, you know, my book got published because I went to the LA Times Festival of Books, found Figueroa Press, and had a conversation with them. And that's what I asked for when I was meeting these different people who had created, you know, publishing companies. Like, how can we have this dialogue about this book and about the writers that are in this community? And so I think about resistance in that context. When I think about resilience as it relates to World Stage Press, I think about Kamal Daoud, who co-founded the World Stage with Billy Higgins. And he said this quote in his documentary that just got just tattooed on my consciousness. And he said, "I do believe there is a place for me and my work in this world, even if I have to create that space." And to me, World Stage Press is about like the creation, like, and proliferation of literature. Like, we invent it, and then we do the work of sharing it. And I just feel like, you know, Black writers in this country have such a huge history of resilience. And that's why our endeavor is to really like publish like the whole canon of African American literature. So we publish Phyllis Wheatley, you know, we put together a collection of Jupiter Hammond's work, you know, 1761. And then like from there, like all the way to like the book that came out last week, you know, like I feel like it's a tradition of resilience. But I think when I think about healing, I think about culturally relevant literature. And I think that offers healing to an invisible damage that's done in school. You know, like all the books that I had to read in high school were written by like dead white people. You know, like Frankenstein and Great Gatsby and all, you know, like all these books. But when I was probably teaching college when Professor Jalandra Davis, who's big at the world stage, put out a book called The Butterfly Jar. And in the book, the main character is 9 years old, growing up through the LA riots. And I was about 10 years old, growing up through the LA riots. It's the first book I ever read that had the word Normandy in it. Adams, Vermont. I was just like Dorsey High School. I was like, what is a book? You know, like, and so, you know, I started requiring that in my classes. You know, students would write essays about it, and then Jalandra would just walk through the door. You know, and to me, like, that experience is healing, to know that, like, you can create, you know, like this literature that's good enough to be in a classroom, good enough to be studied, and can be like used in your own neighborhood, you know, like in your own community as powerful text.
I think that's fantastic. Can we give it up for these panelists? Are they not fantastic? This is what I think of as a slice of Los Angeles, trying to reach various communities in as many ways as we can possibly reach them, supporting one another. And to that extent, we want your questions. So I think Alex is going to give me a little help, but let's open it up to all of you and see what your thoughts, concerns, and questions are. Jelaine.
Hi, this is for Bidhan. How are you partnering with Eddie Jang and the Asian Prison Support Program? And then also, what are the statistics, if you have them, of the number of incarcerated people who have been through the foster care system? Because while there is the school to prison pipeline, I think what we are not talking about enough is the foster care to prison pipeline. And I've heard different statistics depending on the state that it's 50 to 70% of incarcerated people have been through the foster care system. And I'm also connected to a zine that is accepting submissions from adopted, fostered, and trafficked people. So would love to connect and see how we can get even more places for voices to be shared.
Thank you for the question. I'm not sure if I have a great answer for you. English professors aren't great with statistics. I can tell you anecdotally, though, that there are a lot of people in our program who have been through the foster care system, and you're absolutely right. It really is a kind of sets you up to go to. It's like a prep school for prison, really, in a lot of ways, for so many reasons. So, and then we haven't really partnered that much with Eddie, but we would love to down the line. And we have a large population of incarcerated Asian American artists and writers, some of whom are going to be here today as well. So I can follow up with you about that. But I think in the kind of, the bigger picture of what you're talking about with the foster system is, the word in the panel of healing, there is no, certain kind of context you get brought into, and this harm is done and this trauma is caused, and then as a kind of approach, all we can think of in this country is punishment. And there isn't a kind of institutionalized space for healing for those that have had harm from a young age. And so prison becomes a kind of an endpoint for a lot of people that have suffered this kind of, abuse and experience. And so I think, there are models like in Norway, as I brought up, where it's a different philosophy, where if someone's damaged, it's the responsibility of all of us sitting here to think, how can we heal these people, whether they come from the foster system or whatever kind of, marginalized experience they have growing up, rather than just reproducing this trauma, which we seem to do here. And, of course, there's a lot of money in reproducing trauma around the prison industrial complex. And so it really kind of takes everyone to stand up and advocate for something that's much harder to do, i.e. healing, and that isn't motivated by profit or the exploitation of trauma.
Exactly. And before we leave, Jelaine, I want to take the next question. I think this gentleman in the front. But you'll be around if people are interested in that zine that you were talking about. I think that was important. I didn't want it to get lost in the process. So if you're interested, please see her. Yes.
Thank you. This question is for Bidhan once again. Bidhan, so I've been hearing the term healing and I'm hearing the term resilient. So my question to you is, if you were to be the one to architect a healing center in prison, what would that look like, and what would you implement in that center? I'm just curious because, as you know, I was one of the ones who's been experienced incarceration, and there's no healing inside the incarcerated space. And then even once you get out, there's still no healing unless you seek it personally. So what would that look like if you were to introduce something of healing inside those incarcerated spaces?
And even though I wasn't going to kind of identify, but you kind of outed yourself there, Anthony. Anthony was incarcerated when he was 16 and was one of our kind of founding members of the program of Words Uncaged at Lancaster. And he has a memoir here with us called Grit, Grind and Glory. So I encourage you to speak to him to get his direct perspective on this. But I think in general, what I would say in terms of the healing thing is to think of people as participants in the process. So, in the US system, what happens is people are diagnosed with conditions or things that they don't even understand what it means. So how can you heal if you don't know what you're being told? And then these are all the kind of metrics upon which you can leverage your freedom to get out. So the first thing you have to do, I think, is recognize people, human beings who are incarcerated, as human beings who are incarcerated, like as if your brother was there or your sister was there, like, or you were there, instead of like this separate category of people, and then you label those people with these different conditions in which they're not a participant of their own healing. So I think the first thing is to kind of think about people as people and how they can participate in their own healing. And then there's a kind of accountability that takes place from that and a process that takes place from that. Whereas, as you know, when you're incarcerated, Anthony, everything is done to you. There's no autonomy or decision making. And I think without that kind of empowerment of autonomy, any sort of program that you implement is doomed to fail. It's not about the new program necessarily, but that kind of fundamental shift about seeing people as human beings that have the capacity to heal and have that capacity to be something other than the trauma that has defined them for their life.
Other hands, I don't know whose was next, maybe the gentleman in the hat with the red shirt.
Hey all, I'm Derek Dinkla. I'm publisher of a performance zine called Praxinoscope that highlights the after effects of performance in LA. I just got here, so I'm making up as I go along. But I wanted to ask all the panelists, why poetry, why now, and why does it matter?
Okay, so we have 45 minutes. No, I'm just kidding. You want to give it a shot, Hiram? Neela? Quentin? I'll let you off the hook because you've done some talking.
Thank you so much. That's a great question. I think, poetry is so powerful. I guess I'll talk about a book that we just published. Our most recent poetry collection is Trong Tran's Book of the Other, which documents his experience being a adjunct professor in the academic institutions and the kind of racism that you face as a person of color, and really spelling that out. And I think it's so powerful because it was poetry. It was a way for him to capture the experience of how he felt being passed over for tenure track positions multiple times for white people, being told that a black hire was a more diverse hire than him as a queer Vietnamese American man. And in publishing this book and putting out there, what happened to him, we got a lot of pushback from the institution he worked at saying that this book was not fact-checked. And we were able to say, was Shakespeare fact-checked? How do you fact-check poetry? What is the process of fact-checking this man's experience? And I think I'll leave it at that.
I think one thing I would want to answer, even though these are the real panelists, is...
Says the poet laureate.
Because I'm the poet laureate. A lot of people, I'll start with my family, say that same question. What is it about poetry? And it's a succinct distillation of so many of the things that we all experience as human beings. I never worry that poetry is going to go out of fashion. It may not sell like Stephen King. I always like to pick on Stephen King. But if anything major happens, a baby is born, you get married, you get divorced, you move, 9/11, January 6th, they don't go to the fiction writers. Fiction writers are wonderful, but they go to the poets because they understand that poets think about how to wrap language around all of the traumas that this panel has been talking about. So why poetry? Because that's what really feeds people's souls. And at the end of the day, our children rhyme practically without being taught from the time they come out of the womb. They know that sound of poetry and how strong that is. So I think that's why poetry, and it's not why now, it's why always, right? Why always. Okay. Other questions? This gentleman here. Those nifty kicks he has on.
Hello, my name is Traviel. I guess my question is simple. When you talk, ever since I walked in this place, it's a sense of community in here. And my question is for Dr. Roy. What role do the community play in the continuous process of the formerly incarcerated healing? Because a lot of times our community can traumatize a recently released person because of lack of acceptance. And then what happens, the incarcerated person go back to those old wounds and scabs are reopened. So what role do our community play in the continuous healing because I believe that it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to help an incarcerated not reoffend. So what role do the community play in this aspect?
I'm going to have to out you as well, Treviel. Treviel served a life without parole sentence, meaning he was sentenced to die in prison and was actually the last person incarcerated from the LA riots, and was commuted by the governor, how many years ago? 4 years ago. So, well, I think, you know, the kind of reception that you got there is the role that the community plays in a way. When someone, I hate to keep bringing up Norway as if it's like a perfect thing, but just got back from there, and it is so remarkable how different it is. And in Norway, the philosophy is, how do we make this person our neighbor by the time the sentence is up? And so the job of the institution and of the community is to prepare that person to come back into the fold after whatever period the sentence is, and there's no further punishment. So I think the role of the community in a way is for us to go through this process of self-evaluation and reauthoring ourselves, to recognize that some of these categories we have of people are not actual categories. You know, it's like they're not fixed. People change, all of us change, and for us to be able to have the capacity to not stigmatize people that were formerly incarcerated. I just got back from England as well, where I grew up, and I grew up in a poor area of England, and my wife and I were with a lot of my friends, all of whom had been to prison. Nearly everyone at this table that we were at had been to prison, and for pretty serious things, including murder. And what was remarkable was in England, they were just people who had been to prison, served their time, made their mistake. But in the US, it is something completely different. And so I think the role of the community is for those of us I don't mean take responsibility for the actions that others did, but take responsibility for our social and community and collective response, and to allow ourselves to recognize that change happens and to help facilitate that. So, you know, why I think kind of art and writing is a good way of doing it is I don't necessarily think a kind of the sort of political discourse that we have right now is very effective at doing that, because in a way it happens on a more basic human level of like welcoming someone, making some Treviel feel welcome, that this is his space as well, just as much as any of our spaces. And so we have a real responsibility in that way, I think, to shift our own thinking around incarceration and help others shift their thinking as well. And rather than it be kind of adversarial, I prefer to kind of think of it as putting out the positive things of who these people are. When someone meets you, Treviel or Anthony or George, you know, that changes the perception of who someone is that just came out from a life without parole sentence, as Treviel did.
Good response. I was going to say check ourselves, and if we know someone sitting next to us, and maybe we need to have them check themselves, right? Do we have time for a couple more? 2 more. If we have hands. Otherwise, give yourselves a hand. And thank you so much for coming out. We really enjoyed having this conversation with you. I hope you'll take the time to visit all the booths that are represented by these panelists, and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you so much.